In our last lecture, we described the world of Hellenistic Jews and their contributions to the Septuagint and the literature of the Apocrypha. But since the Gospels, whose background we're now going to examine, take place in the land of Israel and among its mostly Jewish inhabitants, we ought to look at the social and cultural life of this region, which came to be called Judea when it was incorporated into the early Roman Empire of Augustus and the Julio-Claudian emperors. In Jewish terms, this was the later Second Temple period. From the establishment of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the early 3rd century BCE through their subjugation to the Roman Empire by the end of the 1st century BCE. Three of our more important sources for what life was like in Judea during this era are the works of Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the literature produced by the first generations of rabbis. Though Josephus grew up in Jerusalem, he spent the last part of his life in Rome, where he wrote a long work in Greek, which was the traditional language of history writing, about the history of the Jews, which he called the Jewish Antiquities. Most of this work discusses events in Judea rather than the diaspora. He also wrote a shorter work about the Judean rebellion against Roman rule in the 60s CE, in which he himself had participated. In a couple of passages in these books, he describes the groups he considered central to the society of his time, though he calls them philosophies rather than social or cultural groups as we might today. The Dead Sea Scrolls, on the other hand, were produced by a group that had chosen to isolate themselves by living in the Judean desert. A number of their works describe in negative terms the society from which they had excluded themselves, and set out their ideas about the nature of the world and what they thought was going to happen to it. The discovery of these works in the 1940s surprised many scholars with the degree to which their ideas remind us of what we know about the structure and the ideas of the early church. The main rabbinic work of this period was the Mishnah, which was not actually composed until around 200 CE, but included many traditions from the time of the Second Temple and the years that followed its destruction. The Mishnah is a set of laws not found in the Torah, but developed as part of what the rabbis called the oral law, and it includes, among other subjects, the punishments, including execution, that were supposed to be inflicted for various crimes, and the compensation awarded for damage to property and people. It also includes rules about observing the Sabbath and festivals, and laws about the impurity caused by contact with certain objects, including corpses, and how it could be reversed. The rabbis of this time also produced the work called the Ethics of the Fathers, which was a collection of statements about ethics and philosophy. So what can we say about what life was like in Judea in the years when the Gospels were being composed? The philosophies mentioned by Josephus also occur in our rabbinic sources, and especially the Pharisees, whom the rabbis of later generations believed were their ideological and legal forerunners. The term Pharisee itself is a Greek form of the Hebrew prushim, or separate, which refers to the particular care they took in keeping laws like giving part of their produce to the poor and maintaining proper ritual purity. This care meant that they trusted each other more than they did other Jews, which was also true of the rabbis of later generations, though they referred to themselves not as Pharisees, but as chaverim, or colleagues. Josephus describes the Pharisees as having been popular with the mass of the people. This may explain the prominence of the term in the Gospels, where it's often used to describe the people whom Jesus encounters and argues with in the course of his activities. The Sadducees, on the other hand, seem to have been members of the priestly class. Their name comes from Tzadok, the priest of King David, and the first of a line of high priests which continued into the Second Temple period. Rabbinic literature portrays the Sadducees as keeping to the literal letter of the Torah rather than interpreting it as the Pharisees did, and of writing down their rules once and for all rather than keeping them in an oral form which was more flexible and could be adapted to new circumstances, as we read in a Pharisaic text of the period. The Sadducees had a book of laws. These are stoned, these are burned, these are killed by the sword, these are strangled. When it was written, a person would ask what to do and go look in the book. If you asked them, How do you know this one is stoned or burned or decapitated or strangled? They would not be able to bring a proof. That is, they wouldn't be able to explain how their rules had been derived, which meant that they knew the letter but not the spirit of the law. Whereas the Pharisees, who were interested in the humanistic principles that they thought lay behind it, tended to limit the capital punishments mentioned in the Hebrew Bible to such specific circumstances that they would very rarely be carried out in practice. Then there were the people whom Josephus calls Essenes. Though he doesn't say so, there is good reason to think that it was members of this group who were living by themselves in the desert next to the Dead Sea, and who we know about from the scrolls they hid in caves during the war with Rome in the 60s CE. These books included biblical texts and their own original writings, which suggest that, like the Sadducees, they were members of the priestly class but had broken with the temple leadership, which they saw as corrupt, and created what they saw as a purer and more ethical society, which they believed would one day return to take control of the temple. Also, like the Sadducees, they had their own written laws. Though the Essenes are nowhere mentioned in the Gospels, they share with the first Christians the belief that the temple was impure, as well as the expectation that the end of the world was fast approaching. Another group which does appear frequently in the Gospels, but isn't mentioned at all by Josephus, is the Scribes. But their identity and role in the Judean society of the time is not at all clear. The term is first used as a title beginning with Ezra in the 5th century BCE, and in his case, it seems to describe someone who both reads out and interprets the law. This would have been necessary both because the text of the Torah contains many laws which had to be expanded upon in order to be put into practice, and because the Jews of Ezra's time and afterward were Aramaic speakers who did not necessarily understand the Hebrew text of the Bible. We also find in the rabbinic literature of later centuries the idea that a group called scribes had been the legal interpreters of the Persian period, and this description might apply to the Gospels as well. For most of the Second Temple period, the Jewish community of Judea was part of either the Persian Empire or one of the Hellenistic kingdoms, but it also had its own leaders who directed its religious and civil affairs and mediated between the population and its foreign rulers. Aside from the latest books of the Bible, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, we have very little information about the Jewish community of the Persian period as compared with the centuries that followed it. But by the time of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms, the Jews are being described as a people ruled by high priests, or Kohanim Gedolim in Hebrew. These were hereditary leaders from the line of King David's high priest Zadok. But while Zadok himself and the priests who followed him in the kingdom of Judah served the interests of their monarch, high priests came to be seen as leaders in themselves in the years after the Jews returned from Babylon in the late 6th century BCE. The prophet Zechariah, who lived at that time, describes as the leaders of his new community a governor appointed by Persia, who was a descendant of the line of David, and a high priest of the line of Zadok. The Ptolemaic monarchy, which ruled both Egypt and Judea in the years after Alexander defeated the Persian Empire, continued to respect the religious authority of the priesthood, though it was very involved in the economic and political life of its subjects. The Ptolemies were replaced around 200 BCE by their neighbors, the Seleucids, who ruled a much more diverse patchwork of societies whose practices and institutions they tended to preserve and even support. We know this not only from Jerusalem itself, but from other Seleucid cities like Babylon, which had powerful temples and priesthoods. But there was one exception to this policy which has been widely debated by modern scholars. This was the rule of Antiochus IV, a Seleucid king of the mid-2nd century BCE who directly interfered with the temple cult in Jerusalem and installed a new high priest. If our Jewish sources from this period are to be believed, Antiochus's goal was nothing less than to wipe out entirely the practice of Judaism. But he was resisted in this by an army led by the family of Judah Maccabee, whose victory is the basis of the story of Hanukkah. This family came to rule the country for about 100 years as a royal dynasty known as the Hasmoneans. and as they were a priestly family, though not of the Sadducite line, they declared themselves high priests, as we know from the coins that they minted. They also came to call themselves kings, even though they were unrelated to the line of David. After the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, the roles of kings and priests were once again separate, and after a brief rule by the family of Herod, which had no prior claim to the throne but was supported by the Roman government, Judea fell under direct Roman control. This was the situation during the time of Jesus' career, when Judea became part of the province of Syria. Rome had recently transitioned to a new form of government under Augustus Caesar, and some of its provinces were now ruled not by the Roman Senate, as they had been before, but by personal representatives of the emperor who were called prefects or procurators. These procurators don't seem to have appointed the high priests mentioned in the Gospels, and instead left this decision to the Herodian kings. But the fact that the Gospels mention more than one high priest at a time suggests that they were not allowed to serve till the end of their lives, which had been the traditional practice. It was around this time that another change in leadership began to appear, from priests to rabbis. One of the religious and legal authorities of Judea in the 1st century BCE was a man called Hillel, whom later generations of Jews regarded as the founder of one of the first scholarly communities to produce rabbis, though the title of rabbi was not used until after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Hillel himself was a Babylonian Jew who arrived in Jerusalem and became, because of his intellectual accomplishments, the scion of a family that supplied many of the Jewish community's leaders in the centuries that followed, most of whom bore the name of either Simon or Gamliel. The Gamliel who leads the Sanhedrin in the book of Acts was Hillel's grandson. But despite the supremacy of Hillel's family, each generation of rabbis was appointed by the one that preceded it, by a process called smicha, or laying on of hands. This meant that anyone, or rather any man, could become a rabbi, so long as a current rabbi thought they were worthy of the name. Given this situation, we might ask a question that is often brought up by readers of the Gospels: was Jesus a rabbi? After all, like Hillel and his successors, Jesus had disciples, a word that means students, who called him rabbi or my master. And he used some of the same techniques of logical argument that we later find among the rabbis of the Talmud. For example, when Jesus says that his disciples are allowed to pick grain on the Sabbath because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus also offered his own interpretations of the text of the Hebrew Bible, which, like those of the rabbis, could veer very far from the literal meaning of the text. For example, he says that because, according to the book of Genesis, God has joined men and women together, they may not be divorced, despite the fact that this is explicitly permitted in the book of Deuteronomy. Yet even though Jesus maintained that Jewish law had to be observed, he did not, according to the Gospels at least, issue his own specific rulings about various aspects of practice as the successors of Hillel did. On the other hand, Jesus is very unlike a rabbi in a number of ways. Where rabbis started as students who learned for years under their mentors, Jesus is depicted as being able at the age of 12 to have a serious debate with the sages in the temple. He is also different from a rabbi to the degree that he is likened to Moses. He is endangered by a king at birth, taken to Egypt, brought to a mountaintop, and shown the whole world. These comparisons to Moses are significant because Hellenistic Jews had begun to describe him as a lawgiver like the mythical figures who had created the constitutions of Greek cities. This meant that Moses was considered personally responsible for the contents of the Torah, and by casting Jesus in the same mold, the New Testament was suggesting that he was not merely interpreting the law, as the rabbis were doing, but issuing a new law of his own. The rabbis, on the other hand, functioned as a group whose rulings were determined by consensus rather than the opinions of any one dominant individual. Jesus is also described as granting to his disciples the power to bind and to loose, in the sense of the power to make the law either stricter or more lenient. This, as Josephus tells us, was a power given to the Pharisees by the Hasmonean queen Salome, and the Talmud associates it with the rabbis, whose majority opinions were believed to have the approval of God. This suggests that Jesus saw himself as having God's permission to change the laws as he saw fit, when in Matthew chapter 16, he says to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." We should also bear in mind that Jesus' career took place around the same time as a number of other charismatic Jewish leaders were gathering followers to whom they were promising deliverance through their power to work miracles, and who were, in some cases at least, being punished by Roman authorities for stirring up sedition. One of these men is even mentioned in the New Testament. When Paul is arrested by Roman soldiers in Jerusalem, he's asked, "Aren't you the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" Jesus' claims about his authority and his mission drew on two ideas that were widespread at the time: that the world was soon going to come to an end as part of some inscrutable divine plan, and that the salvation that would follow would be brought about by a Messiah. We already find speculation about the end of times in the book of Daniel, which was written under the Hasmonean monarchy. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. We also find this speculation in non-canonical books from the same period, like the Book of Jubilees. It was further developed by the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of these scrolls, called the War between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, describes battles fought on earth and in heaven by the forces of good, both human beings and angels. These forces would, of course, be led by a Messiah. As we saw in a previous lecture, the practice of anointing kings and priests with oil was common in Israelite society, and the Hebrew Bible describes the royal descendants of David in the same way. This meant that the Messiah, associated with the end of days, would be, like David, a military leader and a member of the royal line. But by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, around the 2nd century BCE, there were a number of different theories about his identity and character. He could be either a priest who teaches the law or a warrior descendant of David. The Dead Sea Scrolls and other texts of the period also attribute divine powers to him, including healing the sick and resurrecting the dead. One of the scrolls describes a messianic banquet. This is the sitting of the men of renown called to the assembly for the council of the community, when God will have begotten the Messiah among them. The priest shall enter at the head of the congregation of Israel. Afterwards, the Messiah of Israel shall enter. And when they gather for the community table, or to drink wine, and arrange the community table, and mix the wine to drink, let no man stretch out his hand over the first fruits of bread and wine before the priest. For it is he who shall first stretch out his hand over the bread, and afterward the Messiah of Israel shall stretch out his hands over the bread. These ideas, the approach of the end, its suddenness, and the arrival of a chosen Savior, are all laid out by Jesus in the Gospels, as in Matthew chapter 24, where he tells his followers that the temple will be destroyed sometime soon, and what signs of the end of the age they should look for. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. But anyone who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Then, in Mark chapter 14, he tells the high priest that he is the Messiah and will sit at the right hand of God. The Gospel of Matthew, moreover, begins with a genealogy whose purpose is to show that Jesus was a direct descendant of David. In the gospel narrative, Jesus' claim to be the Messiah results in his trial and condemnation by the Jewish court, i.e., the Sanhedrin. So, what do we know about this body? It seems to have existed in one form or another for a very long time before the birth of Christianity. Its members met with the high priest as a council or court at least as far back as the Hasmonean kings, and had served alongside the Herodians as well. It also came into conflict with them, especially Herod himself, and it sometimes turned to the Roman authorities to lodge complaints about the king's behavior. According to the Gospels, it seems to have been not a council, but a criminal court, whereas in later rabbinic literature, it's more of a lawmaking body. This ambiguity about what the Sanhedrin actually did, combined with the fact that its powers were limited to whatever the Roman governor would allow it, raises the question of whether the Jewish authorities of Jesus' time actually had the power to try him in the manner described in the Gospels. We know that, generally speaking, the governors of Roman provinces did not intervene in conflicts among the local inhabitants, who were usually not Roman citizens themselves, and so were allowed to judge according to their own laws. But documentary evidence from across the empire suggests that the procurators of imperial provinces had full authority over whether to inflict capital punishments. This would explain an event described by Josephus, when the high priest Ananus, in order to flaunt his authority, has James, the brother of Jesus, killed, which he is able to do because the Roman procurator had died and his replacement had not yet arrived. Though Ananus got away with this, members of the Jewish community contacted the new procurator to complain, because they believed he had broken the law by acting without Roman approval, and he was removed from his office. It's also clear from our sources that Roman provincial governments were generally interested in what they perceived as public disturbances, and they were particularly concerned with any groups or organizations that might be a breeding ground for conspiracies. This included the messianic movements that were springing up in Judea. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, the leaders of the people bring Jesus to Pilate and claim that he is causing unrest, telling the people not to pay taxes and calling himself a king. Now, as far as our rabbinic sources are concerned, the Sanhedrin of this era had the power to try civil cases, i.e., cases in which the guilty party had to pay damages, but it had lost the power to try criminal ones about 20 years after Judea became part of a Roman province, when King Herod died in 6 CE. These sources place it at odds with the gospel accounts of how the court treated Jesus. So does the way that the rabbis describe the Sanhedrin's procedures and rules for capital trials, when these were still permitted. For example, they could not be held at night or just before Passover, which is exactly what happens in the New Testament. But we should bear in mind that the Gospels themselves disagree about many of the specific details. We should also bear in mind that the Gospels were motivated to place the blame on the Jews as a group, rather than on the Roman authorities, even though Jesus' actions were likely to have seemed as politically suspect to them as the actions of the other popular leaders they were punishing around that time. After all, even though the setting of the Gospels is clearly the land of Israel and its Jewish population, most or all of the Gospel writers were not themselves Jews, and they were engaged in a war of ideas with a Jewish community with which they no longer identified and from which they were working to separate themselves. The author of Matthew is the only Gospel writer who was thought by some people to have been Jewish himself. He's familiar with aspects of Jewish law, and he may have been writing for a Jewish Christian community. But he's also very hostile toward the Pharisees, and he sees Peter as the head of the church, rather than James, who led the Christian community of Jerusalem. The other Gospels, in any case, were aimed at a broad Gentile audience which had no particular connection to the Jewish world, so they were motivated to portray the Jews as a uniformly hostile and malevolent collective, rather than a mixed and diverse group, which after all included Jesus and his disciples. In our next lecture, we'll look at the world of the early church and what it can tell us about the next part of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul.